So I think this cut off at a place that I wasn't intending, and let me continue, and I'll try to be quicker this time around just to finish up this part of the lecture. I think I was still talking. Hopefully, I talked about Native Americans and women. If I didn't, let me just quickly say that the Dawes Act was something about was an attempt to bring Native Americans um, into the U.S. political system that hadn't existed before, but it still denied a lot of Native American heritage, and still today there's a lot of tragedy surrounding that. And with women, the right to vote was finally enacted. Um, in 1920, and with the 19th Amendment, and women were able to participate in the first election, first federal election that women were allowed to participate in, and elected Warren G. Harding. Uh, and and very quickly about black voters in the South. The reason I mention it that in in that kind of a narrow category is because the civil rights movement was really all about bringing black voters in the South into the U.S. electoral and political system, and a lot of pressure through nonviolence was took place in order to make that happen. Um, but it was because the party system at the time, the Democratic Party, had been set up basically to exclude black voters from participating in the South. And the reason the South was so significant for the black population is because the majority of the black population in the U.S. Lived there then, and I believe still lives there today, a little over 50%. And so the South has a disproportionately kind of influential cultural stamp on the African American community, and and vice versa. So the party system was between Democrats and Republicans during this time from the end of the Civil War until the 1960s. But the reason why civil rights was such an important thing to be talking about was that civil rights and rights are very much intertwined. And the reason the two parties looked after the interests of their constituents in the way that they did was because that's who their voters were, and that's who counted to them. And the Democratic Party was the South. It was most voters in the South, and you have to understand that as a dynamic between the Democrats and Republicans. Republicans were considered by Southerners for a couple of generations, for several generations, to be the party of Lincoln, the party of the North, the party of the Union, the party of carpetbaggers and kind of um, domination economically and politically during Reconstruction and afterwards of the South as a reconstructed kind of conquered territory. So they hated the North, or a lot of people in the South hated the North, a lot of white people in the South particularly. But because they had allowed and even facilitated by way of federal troops as election monitors uh, African American voting, they had the loyalty of the North, the Republican Party, had the loyalty of African American voters for just as long. But it was to no avail because systematically the South and the Democratic Party had excluded African Americans from voting. And so systematically. So all the way through to the 1950s and the 1960s, civil rights, the right to participate in the civil life of a democracy, was not held by African Americans in the South, and they weren't counted, and because they weren't counted, they weren't considered, and so of course, schools, for example, were denied funding. Schools were not giving an equal chance to public school students of different racial backgrounds, not to mention socioeconomic backgrounds, and so it had a direct effect on and not to mention hospitals as well, uh, on the welfare of the populations, of the white and black populations, particularly in the South. Um, but what happened in the 1920s and 30s was what's often called the Great Migration, and there was a couple of bad drought periods in the South and in the West too, and a lot of people went looking for work in industrial centers in the North, places like Detroit and New York and Chicago, and even Boston, and and a lot of black populations ended up moving to those cities, and they were systematically again excluded from kind of the ordinary neighborhoods, and grouped by the real estate industry largely into segregated poorer neighborhoods. And this is where redlining comes from, something I'm not going to talk about right now. Um, but basically, black voters in the North started to join this kind of more liberal in the North Democratic Party and pressure the National Democratic Party to start pressuring the South to liberalize and grant equal human rights and voting rights to oftentimes their family members who still resided in the South. And so this was a slow process, and eventually the Democratic Party did move to pretty significantly left on race, to the point where there was a walkout staged by some segregationist Democratic senators and governors during the 1948 Democratic Convention. And then eventually, when the Civil Rights Act was passed, President Lyndon Johnson did say, "We've just lost the South for a generation for the Democratic Party." And he was sort of right. But as we saw in this election, nothing lasts forever. And Georgia and maybe North Carolina, I haven't seen the latest news, but certainly Georgia looks like it's been won for Joe Biden, and at least one or two other states in the South have as well. And Bill Clinton was able to win Louisiana, I believe, and so these things seem to be evolving. But so the parties have been sort of determined by race, because once the liberal Democratic Party emerged from the civil rights movement, the Republican Party moved in, and there had been enough time passed and enough water under the bridge that Republicans no longer were considered the party of Lincoln. They were the party of conservatives, and conservative white voters especially flocked to the Republican Party in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, to the point where now you have a pretty good chance, if you're a white voter in the South, probably 70% chance that you vote for Republicans regularly, and a 90% chance you vote for Democrats regularly if you're a black voter. But that, those things again evolve and change, but these are just tendencies I'm describing. Um, as far as electors in the House, I want to mention really quickly. The Electoral College is sometimes thought of, and maybe should be thought of, as a relic of the slavery era, because everyone who has studied the Senate knows the Senate was kept as a check on large states, but that could mean really northern states, and southern states were kept in equal number through things like the Missouri Compromise. They took great pains during negotiations of admitting new states in the Union, in westward expansion, to make sure that there's an equal number of really states where people could not be enslaved and states where people were enslaved, and so that it could never be abolished nationwide, is the reason they kept an equal number of states in the Senate as a check on that peculiar institution of slavery. That check on to make sure that it was defended and that it was not taken away. So the Electoral College is part of that era, and has it was initially crafted, as we know, by the Constitution framers, because they felt that it was a good way to just ensure an independent executive, and it was not something where the president was going to be controlled by Congress. And so they had no real mechanism or conception of what a popular vote was, and I think it's fair to say, and they just said, well, we're going to appoint learned men, electors in every state. and those people are going to choose, the most qualified president if they all get together. That's not what happened. They started choosing, yes, Washington. It's happened with Washington. But after that, parties very quickly emerged, and those parties learned that they could recruit people to vote for, their candidate of choice, and they didn't have to, concede to a consensus choice, to accede to a consensus choice. And so, with the 12th Amendment, they basically enacted that there was not going to be that there was going to be a kind of political party structure in the U.S. and they kind of changed the electoral college process to reflect that, and they still allowed an equal number of they still allowed every state to send at least two senators to the electoral college, despite the kind of disproportionate population in some of the smaller states. That really it doesn't seem fair at all that Wyoming gets three electoral college votes, and so one electoral college vote represents 100,000 people, whereas one electoral college vote in say California represents something like 700,000 people. So this kind of principle of one person, one vote is really not honored in the electoral college or the Senate for that matter. So I think it's fair to call them relics of this slavery era, but because it's so fundamental in terms of the separation of powers, it would be very difficult to dismantle, and we would probably have to end up at least having a runoff election for president, and hardly anyone seems to want things like that, but. They do that in France. They do that. Well, they used to do it in Russia before there was a dictatorship. But they do it in some countries that elect a powerful president. They have a runoff election where they have two stages. But because the political parties are so state-based and it encourages a two-party system when you have all these state-based elections and district-based elections. You may see this happen, but I think you would see a very different American political landscape emerge if you got rid of the electoral college, and I think a lot of people are afraid of that. Finally, the House is worth mentioning because they have 435 members in the House, and this is contrary to really what the initial formation of the Constitution said, which is that for every 30,000 people, there should be a representative. So they kept expanding it as the U.S. grew with every census every 10 years. But in 1911, they did decide that they would just fix the number at 435 because they didn't want to build more chambers in the House, or a bigger chamber in the House and more offices. So there's nothing in the Constitution that says there needs to be 435 members. It was just a decision, a law that was made.